everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that I think you're really going to enjoy. Before we get started with today's episode, I wanted to let you know about the Blaze documentary, The Cover-Up. Most Americans have been aware of Anthony Fauci since the COVID pandemic really took off in 2020. But Dr. Richard Ebright, a molecular biologist from Rutgers University, has had Fauci on his radar since the 2001 anthrax scare, after which Dick Cheney empowered him and the NIAID with the authority and funding for biodefense once reserved solely for the Department of Defense. In the latest episode of Matt Keeby's documentary series, The Cover-Up, he joins Dr. Ebright as he walks us through a series of embarrassments that begins with the recreation of the deadly 1918 Spanish flu and culminates with the coming of COVID-19. Together, Matt Keeby and Richard Ebright will connect the dots and trace the funding, giving you the answers you've been demanding for years about the dark research, fraud, and corruption surrounding Anthony Fauci. It's a fatal culture of hubris and graft that left so much destruction and mistrust in its wake. You can watch episode 4 of The Cover-Up Smoking Gun on Blaze TV, available now. You just have to become a subscriber by going to FauciCoverup.com/Auron and using the code SMOKINGGUN for $30 off your subscription. That's FauciCoverup.com/Auron, and the code is SMOKINGGUN for $30 off your subscription. All right, guys. So America is an empire. A lot of people don't necessarily like that title, but it is the truth. And all empires go through certain phases of expansion and contraction that can decide whether or not they continue on being a strong player on the world stage or someone that overextends and weakens itself. Where are we as the United States? We have Donald Trump talking about perhaps acquiring Greenland. Should we be overseeing Palestine? All of these different foreign policy ventures. But at the same time, he's also trying to pull us out of the war in Ukraine, talking about starting fewer wars overseas. So which is it? Are we expanding? Are we contracting? Which one is good? Is that good for the empire, for the people of the United States? One thing that we like to do is, of course, look to the past for these answers, and there's nothing more American than LARPing as Romans. So we're going to be looking at two distinct emperors in the Roman pantheon. We're going to be looking at Trajan and Hadrian. What were their backgrounds like? What role did they play in their imperial history? And can we take any of those lessons forward into America today? Here discussing that with me today is a history professor, someone who is well-versed in ancient history, Alex Petkas. Thanks for joining me, man.
Great to be back, Auron.
Absolutely. So let's just dive right into it. You are our subject matter expert. We'll start with our first chronological emperor here, Trajan. What is Trajan known for in general? What is his general reputation? And then set a stage. What is the context of the Roman Empire where he is stepping into power?
Yeah. So these are two great emperors to contrast, Trajan and Hadrian. Trajan is known as the Optimus Princeps. That was the title given to him by his contemporaries. It means the best Princeps. Princeps means first citizen. You know, the best emperor is basically what it means. And he had quite a legacy in the medieval period and in modernity. But he was born sometime in the 60s, but he comes in the 50s. He comes to power in 98 AD, and he is working in a world where Rome has really achieved a height of power. So Rome has been functioning since as a republic for the first 450 years or so, from about around 500 BC down to 31 BC. But even as it was a republican government, with the Senate and consuls and, elected officials and, ruled by some kind of an oligarchy with the participation of the people, it had an empire as early as the 4th or 3rd century BC. So they win a war with Carthage, and they get their first overseas territory in Sicily in the early 3rd century BC, and then on and on. And by the time of Augustus, even before this transition from republic to what we call the Roman Empire, the monarchy in 31 BC, they already have this overseas expansion. They control most of the Mediterranean by that time. And so this transition from republic to empire that Trajan is inheriting has been stable since 31 BC. He's so it's more than 100 years old. And some things that changed that are interesting about the Roman Empire as opposed to the Roman Republic. Augustus, the first emperor, decided to keep around a lot of the old institutions of the republic, at least as kind of vestigial organs. So you have like the consuls still, a senate still. It doesn't wipe all of that away immediately. There's still notionally elected offices. I mean, the emperor really gets to pick who gets elected, as it were. And that was how Augustus wanted it to be, because you still need to rule with the consent and help of the nobility, the most wealthy, talented men in the empire. And so that's the kind of structural status of the empire. You've got an emperor sitting at the top of what was once a republican constitution. One of the things that Augustus did was to set borders firmly on Roman imperial expansion. So he conquers Spain and he knocks around and firms up the Germans, and the border on the Rhine with the Germans, and goes on a few campaigns, but says towards the end of his reign, my advice, citizens, is that we keep the borders the way they are right now. We can't afford further expansion. It's just not within our power as an empire to go beyond the Rhine border and the Danube and push further into the east. They already control the Levant, Syria, Palestine, but he says don't try to go conquer Parthia, or don't try to colonize all of Germany and Northern Europe. It's not worth the effort, and we couldn't sustain it. And that was the situation that most of the emperors up through Trajan had adhered to, with the notable exception that under Claudius in the 40s, the Romans conquered Britain. Julius Caesar had made an expedition there, but had never set up an official Roman presence. So that's kind of the status quo of the empire when Trajan inherits it, roughly.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important thing to note, because this, again, mirrors so much of the confusion that I think occurs in the American instance. As you point out, Rome was a republic while it was still operating as an empire. And
right.
So this artificial binary of, we have a republic and then we flick a switch with Julius Caesar and all of a sudden we have an empire just isn't correct. Rome starts as a monarchy. It drives out the kings. It becomes the republic. But as it's a republic, it still expands. It still takes on an imperial aspect. It doesn't have to have an emperor to be an empire. And then when it changes from what we would recognize as far more republican rule to a return to the monarchical structure, they still keep many of the aspects. The forms of the government tradition are still observed. The Senate's still there. A lot of this stuff, the consuls are still there. And so for the average person, they would know something had changed, but a lot of what they recognized as central to Roman identity as a republic still remained after they crossed into the period that we recognize as imperial. And all of the people leading up, like Marius and Sulla, to Julius Caesar and then Augustus, obviously they cut a figure that is as close to a dictatorship in many ways as Caesar did. So the idea that was just the crux is a little bit of a narrative shift for us. And so as we look as Americans at our own situation, it's important to remember that we're not the first country to go through significant changes in the way that we are governed, while still considering ourselves to have a continuity inside the original form of governance. I don't think Octavian really went out and said, the Republic is dead and now I am the emperor, right? He was very careful not to do that for good
Exactly.
reason. And any American president, be it Lincoln or FDR or others that fundamentally shifted the way that America operates, were also relatively careful to maintain many of the aspects of American tradition while changing significantly the way that it operates. And so I think it's a good thing to understand that Trajan is entering into a system that has undergone significant shifts, but not quite the binary switch that we're thinking of. It's been a slow shift over time into this imperial identity that we look back and kind of impose on today. But he is entering into a situation that has been evolving towards kind of his current rule.
That's right. And continuity was so important to keep the peace for Augustus. And another thing that is an important continuity with the Republic is that you might think that in the Roman Empire, all of the free people are Roman citizens, but that's very much not the case. Paul has in the Book of Acts has this special status as a Roman citizen. It's quite exceptional for a provincial to have Roman citizen status. And in the Republic, the Romans were very jealous with citizenship grants because civitas comes from the word for city, and the idea of having a citizen of a grand kingdom was kind of a category mistake for the early Romans. And so they slowly expanded citizenship, and it was by the time of Augustus, it's mostly restricted to cities and nobilities in Italy, with the occasional very honored provincial getting citizenship status. Citizenship gives you legal privileges, and citizenship gives you theoretically the ability to run for office. But you can be a subject of the emperor and a free person without being a citizen. And this ends up being one of the issues that kind of ties into the challenges that Trajan and his successor Hadrian are dealing with. Is how do you maintain happy provincials who are willing to help you out with the business of, say, tax collecting, keeping the peace, just doing a lot of the grunt work of administration without them necessarily being citizens? What is the basis of fostering a willing sense of unity in these people? Because the way that the Romans rule and want to rule is with willing subjects and with justice. This is very much a part of the Roman self-image, that they are the justice of peoples, and they are the the people protected by Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the king of the universe, who is the king, the god of justice, right? So that's something that we'll see playing out in the reign of both Trajan and Hadrian. Is like, how do you keep these people united, and what does it mean to be a citizen?
Yeah, it was very funny. At one point, I was in an exchange with someone on Twitter, and they're like, "Well, the Romans would just let anybody be a citizen. That's what bound them together." I'm like, "Oh no, buddy! Like that's like the Italians had to go to war to get citizenship from the Romans. They literally had to start multiple wars in order to finally win the right of citizenship. So your concept, your modern concept of kind of the mass franchise, just did not exist, even to the people who you are trying to ascribe that to. We always get this with the Greeks and then the Romans, like, oh well, they had democracy. It's like, no, it's not even close to what you're thinking. Like, yes, they called certain aspects of this democratic, but it is wildly different than anything. The Athenians would have laughed at your understanding of democracy, and so would the Romans. The idea that an immigrant could walk in and 2 or 3 years later raise their hand and suddenly have the full rights of a Roman-born citizen or an Athenian-born citizen just did not exist for these people. These are not the same things. Their understanding of community and governments we're just totally alien to you at this point. But let's get into Trajan's reign himself. So, how does he come to power? And as you said, the empire had been kind of given these boundaries previously. Why does he end up in a situation where he's rethinking those and considering conquest?
So Trajan comes to power. He builds his career as a soldier, mainly under Domitian, especially. Domitian was reigning for about 15 years. Domitian is a man that Trajan wants to contrast himself with. So Domitian was hated by the Senate for being authoritarian and kind of priggish and sort of weird, but also a micromanager. And for all that the Senate hated him, he was quite a capable administrator, and he had firmed up the boundaries of the Roman limes, and been a very jealous guarder of the solidity of the currency. But he gets murdered by some slaves within his court, I think, that just came to detest him. And so the Romans pick this guy Nerva as his successor, who's a sort of a very safe candidate, very old candidate. So it's not much risk if the guy is pushing his mid-70s, right? To pick that guy as emperor. He's a political survivor. Nerva he's a senator from a good family. Nerva picks very quickly Trajan as his adoptive son and successor. And that's, a lot of people joke that this is the greatest act of Nerva's reign, which was very short. And he picks Trajan as his successor and essentially dies within 18 months of becoming emperor. And so Trajan is left around 40 years old as the sole ruler of the greatest empire history had ever seen. And one of the first things he does is he comes to Rome after he really takes his time to come back to Rome, because he's off firming up the defenses on the Rhine boundary. Good Roman soldier. He comes to Rome and he says it's a new era. No more secret police like you had under Domitian. He frees a bunch of political prisoners. He returns a lot of property that the imperial fisc had confiscated from Domitian's enemies. And he quickly establishes himself as a favorite of the Senate. He cuts back the bureaucracy that just had as a tendency to increase as this kind of alternate power structure under the emperors. The emperors want to have direct control, and they often recruit people from outside the senatorial ranks, freedmen. There's eunuchs running around. So Trajan tries to kind of dry that out a little bit, and he quickly, before he gets to Rome, he makes a tour of the borders of the Roman Empire, which, as we said, are basically the Rhine and the Danube, running through Germany, Switzerland, Austria, down through Bulgaria is where the Danube empties into the Black Sea. And while he's in the Balkans, he notices something fishy is going on. So there's this area of in the Central Balkans, now modern Romania, called Dacia. And one Greek commentator from earlier in history had observed that if anybody were to unite these incredibly warlike tribes of this area of the Balkans, that man could be a challenger to any earthly power. I mean, these people are incredibly warlike, and somebody has risen to power that has done just that, united all these Dacians under one throne. His name is Decebalus or Decebalus. And he actually was engaging in raids across the Roman border. These are lands that are not controlled directly by Rome, north of the Danube. He's raiding, and Domitian kind of buys him off. Basically, he says it's not worth it to try to go to war with these people. And so essentially, to the shame of Rome, Domitian starts sending payments to Decebalus on the condition, or with the promise from Decebalus, that, Decebalus has all these even more warlike barbarian tribes north of him, the Sarmatians and the Marcomanni and the Getae, and he's going to build a bunch of forts to serve his dutiful role as a buffer state for the Romans. But when Trajan gets there, he's in Moesia, the nearby province. He gathers information. He realizes Decebalus is not fortifying forts against his northern enemies. He's fortifying a bunch of forts with, as it were, the guns pointed towards Rome. He's actually fortifying himself to become an independent king. And, if this guy can rally other tribes like the Marcomanni and the Sarmatians, I mean, they could lop off a huge chunk of the Roman Empire. So Trajan decides something's got to be done. And these Dacians kind of remind me of the Mexican cartels in a way. They're these half civilized, but very, very warlike, very kind of militarily sophisticated people. They have great siege proof forts. They have engines of war, and they have a strange religion that teaches that if you die in battle, you can live forever. It's like a gateway to immortality. So like if a Dacian charges into a Roman line and gets run through with a spear, he goes straight to Valhalla, as it were. And he makes these people incredibly brave in battle. And so they're a very fearsome people and a very worthy rival for the Romans. And so Trajan starts circulating the propaganda, and he quickly makes his way to Dacia, and the Senate loves it. This is a hark back to the old times. We got a soldier emperor on the throne, a guy like Cincinnatus or a Cato the Elder, and it has this kind of good old days energy, like finally another manly conquest of these tribes that have never been under Roman sway. So that's his first mission. So he fights a war in Dacia. And
so we have. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say we have an interesting reversal for what a lot of people would see as the high and low versus middle dynamic of power. As you point out, most emperors recognize that the Senate, the aristocracy, is a limit on their own power, and so they try to elevate people from outside. We see this over and over again. Upstart emperors or people that want to change the kind of entrenched social status inside the power structures inside Rome. They go out, they get freedmen, or they get barbarians, or they elevate a lot of people to the senatorial rank that otherwise wouldn't have this, or they put them in charge. In a little way, we can see this with Trump now, right? He's pulling guys like RFK Jr., Tulsi Gabbard, Kash Patel, people who specifically have been treated as basically enemies of kind of the entrenched interest currently. And he recognizes that elevating them, people who are going to be loyal to him for their elevation rather than to the system, the current ruling oligarchy, gives him an advantage, right? And this is what a lot of emperors did, but Trajan goes the other direction. He decides that he is going to ingratiate himself with the senatorial class, with the established kind of oligarchic understanding, the aristocracy, because he is going to hearken back to these glory days, right? As you're saying, he's going to create a form that is going to encourage what was kind of the legacy of Rome at that time, what many in the aristocratic class would have recognized as the height of Rome. We're going to go out. We've got a soldier in charge again. We're going to conquer territory again. This is going to bring us back to greatness, and this is the kind of thing that the good old boys like to see, right? And so that's one of the things that it's a different way to derive power, but it is an avenue to power, to kind of almost a revanchist strain, right? We're going to return the Senate to some level of power. We're going to ingratiate ourselves with it. We're going to do some important works, and we're going to put a soldier who's going to go out and capture territory back at the head of the empire. This is something that's going to excite the classic aristocratic sense inside the Senate.
Exactly. And I think Trajan felt when he came to power that, he had the emperor is in a really strong position compared to where he was with Augustus. There's talk in the days of Caligula and maybe even Nero of like bringing the Republic back. That's all totally gone at this point. And so now, he can afford to ingratiate himself with these old families. And indeed he does. And so they march this army out to Dacia, and the first try at it doesn't go all that well. I mean, they win, some very costly, bloody victories, and they get a sense of how difficult these people are going to be to defeat. And before Trajan can really get on a roll and steamroll them, Decebalus, the king, surrenders, and he says, "I'll be your client, and let's make a treaty." And Trajan says, he's taken a few punches at this point. They've won some victories, but they've been very costly. He says, fine. And they annex a little bit of Dacian territory, and they make him destroy a bunch of his forts. And he promises again to fortify the northern border. And but Trajan, on leaving, just to be sure, he builds this massive, famous bridge across the Danube, and which was the greatest bridge ever built at that point. and piles of it still stand today, and I believe it's in Serbia. So kind of as a warning, we have an easy way back to get back across the Danube. It's something like 1,000 meters long. It's huge. But sure enough, Decapolis pretty soon is suborning nearby tribes to go raid across the border. And so Trajan finally, frustrated, he returns and he finishes the job. Long story short, sets siege to their capital city. Decebalus is hunted down. He escapes, but he's chased down by horsemen, and he commits suicide. And this is all depicted on Trajan's column that we'll get to in a moment. But one of the things that he gets from this conquest is, so Decebalus had this crafty idea of, Dacia is a very, very wealthy region because it has some of the best gold mines in the Mediterranean at that time. So what Decebalus does is he buries his royal treasure in a stream bed. He redirects a stream and then digs it up, buries all the gold and loot, and covers it with rocks, and then redirects the stream back over the river. And it's a secret that nobody's supposed to know, but somebody betrays this fact to Trajan. And so, of course, Romans, the world's greatest engineers, they find the treasure, and he brings back this incredible loot back to Rome, like one of the greatest troves of treasure that had ever been brought back to Rome, since the days of Pompey the Great conquering Mithridates. And so with that money, Trajan starts on this glorious building campaign. He builds the Forum of Trajan, which is by far the greatest of the Roman imperial forums. He builds the Column of Trajan with the kick-ass Trajan statue on top of it, and the column's still standing today. The Christians replaced it with the statue of St. Peter on top instead of Trajan. And he builds baths, and Trajan just becomes this incredibly popular emperor. Everybody loves new building works. They reflect well on the city. The people are happy. Trajan uses the money to formalize a charity program throughout Italy for orphans, and to educate orphans and feed them. I mean, he's just the hero. And that's kind of where things stand once he gets back from the Second Dacian War.
So he's made Rome great again here. That's
absolutely
right.
Yeah, and he's turned Dacia into a province, notably, and Dacia continues to be a Roman province for about 150 years, and he it founds the origins of the Romanian people, who speak a Latinate language to this day because of Roman Dacia.
So I think this is important for people to recognize, whether you're skeptical of the empire or you're someone who approves of this. It's important to recognize that the imperial expansion is popular, right? It's popular with the nobility. It's popular with the people. Everyone likes to be a conqueror. Everyone likes to see a bunch of extra money flow into the coffers. Everyone likes to see these great works built. This is something that cements legacies. And so the incentive structure for imperial conquest is incredibly high. Like that is something that you can understand why the people who do it are remembered as great, and you can understand why people are regularly driven to do it, even if they know it comes with consequences and downsides. And so, again, no matter where you stand on that issue, if you're worried about the expansion of an American empire, or you think ultimately that's great that America is this, doing kind of the Turbo America thing, just remember that the incentives for leaders to commit to this, it's not just their own personal greatness, though that matters, but this is what people often want. This is what ruling classes often want. This is what elevates people to greatness. There's a reason that guys like Bronze Age Pervert recognize that this is something that is a great cultural achievement, and it is a natural impetus for many cultures to kind of assert their will on others. It's a deeply human impulse, and it's one that, again, whether you approve of or disapprove of, is always with us and is incredibly popular for a reason. So speaking of contrasts, obviously Trajan, he's building orphanages like you're talking about, is creating these programs. There's another force in the empire at this point. Christianity is growing, right? We know that this is a force that is increasing. It's a strange religion for a lot of Romans, but it's having a deep impact across. What is Trajan's interaction with the Christians? How does he treat that? What does he think about them? How is that impacting the way that he is building his empire or expanding his empire?
Yeah, I think that this Trajan was also remembered as a great peacetime ruler, and his dealings with the Christians, arguably show some moderation. We know a lot about what Trajan did with the Christians, and what happened to the Christians in his time because of this letter exchange that he has with this guy Pliny. Pliny the Younger was a great man of letters and a senator and a lawyer, but he gets sent out to Bithynia, which is in Asia Minor, kind of on the Asian side of the Bosporus, very, very civilized area, and he's trying to deal with local problems. Trajan's attitude toward provincial administration in general is very decentralized, very hands-off. Pliny keeps coming back with these sort of potentially micromanaging problems that a guy like Domitian would want to give him a specific instructions and know everything that's going on. And Trajan's general attitude is, Pliny, you got this. Really, I trust your judgment in most cases. There is one interesting instance where Pliny talks about how some local city is wanting to start their own fire brigade. And on this, Trajan sort of pushes back and he says, these things tend to get political very quickly, which I think is really interesting. So if you wanna kind of form your own base of power, maybe you should start a local fire brigade. That's the Romans were very suspicious of these associations, and that's one of the reasons why the Christians were a problem. And Pliny writes this long letter 97 to Trajan. You can look this up if you're interested, detailing this issue that he's had with local Christians. And so the Christians are one of the big problems with the Christians. They're sort of a known quantity to a governor like Pliny at this time, and Trajan's sort of familiar with the Christians by this time. There were talks of them being burned on pyres in the reign of Nero, but by this time the Christians are known for being stubborn and superstitious, possibly meeting in secret to eat babies. There's all these lurid accusations that the apologists talk about. But the main thing that the Romans are frustrated with the Christians on is that they won't typically, if they're really obdurate Christians, they won't sacrifice to the gods, and they won't sacrifice to the genius of the emperor. The emperors have been divinized upon death since Julius Caesar. Augustus did it first, and there's a kind of imperial cult already at this time where you're supposed to burn incense, to the guiding genius of the emperors, and sort of in front of the statue of an emperor. And the Christians won't do this, and it's seen, and kind of like in the way that Fustel de Coulanges talks about how religion, the ancestral hearth, is the foundation of the family unit. The tribal hero cult is the foundation of the tribal unit, and similarly with the city, the state cults are sort of like the basis of whether or not you're in the community, and whether or not your community is doing well is whether you're sacrificing regularly. I mean, it's a lot of ways a similar situation with the Roman imperial cult. It's like the proof of whether you're like a citizen in good standing or not. Right. And so Pliny, says, I've executed a few and they've been stubborn, and, asked them a few times and threatened them. And I thought, just their stubbornness was grounds enough to execute these people. But I want to read for you a little passage that I think is really interesting. It's from this famous letter that gives you a sense of what the Christians' situation was from the eyes of Pliny. So here's Pliny on the Christians, and one of the things he says that's a key point is there's been, once it's gotten out that the governor has been prosecuting Christians for sedition, these accusations have started to flare up, as often happens, right? People are like, I could get so and so's farm if I get him accused of being a Christian. But here's what Pliny says. Others were named by an informer, stated that they had been Christians and then denied it. The informer said that, and they denied it. They said that, in fact, they had been, but had abandoned their allegiance some 3 years previously. some more years earlier, one or two as many as 20 years before. All these as well worshipped your statue, Trajan, he's writing to Trajan, and images of the gods, and blasphemed Christ, which Pliny notes is something that you can't get a confirmed Christian to do. They maintained, however, that all that their guilt or error involved was that they were accustomed to assemble at dawn on a fixed day, presumably Sunday, to sing a hymn antiphonally to Christ as God, and to bind themselves by an oath, not for the commission of some crime, but to avoid acts of theft, brigandage, and adultery, not to break their word, and not to withhold money deposited with them when asked for it. When these rites were completed, it was their custom to depart, and then to assemble again to take food, which was, however, common and harmless. They had ceased, they said, to do this, following my edict, by which, in accordance with your instructions, I had outlawed the existence of secret brotherhoods. He's talking about the fire brigades. So I thought it all the more necessary to ascertain the truth from two maidservants who were called deaconesses, even by employing torture. I found nothing other than a debased and boundless superstition. So the thrust of the letter is, I've got the Christian problem taken care of, but, advice on some particulars. And here's Trajan's very brief response to Pliny. He says, "You have followed the appropriate procedure, my Pliny Secundus, in examining the cases of those brought before you as Christians, for no general rule can be laid down which would establish a definite routine. Interestingly, Christians are not to be sought out, but if brought before you and found guilty, they must be punished. But in such a way that a person who denies that he is a Christian and demonstrates this by his action, that is, by worshiping our gods, may obtain pardon for repentance, even if his previous record is suspect. Documents published anonymously, this is key, must play no role in any accusation, for they give the worst example and are foreign to our age." And so, as somebody who's seen friends become the victims of anonymous accusations ending in cancellation, I think there's a kind of like an anti-woke strain in Trajan, and he's talking about this is foreign to our age. We're not in the age of Domitian anymore, when people can get canceled, as it were, executed for anonymous allegations of whispering against the princeps.
It feels like there's a little bit of don't ask, don't tell policy involved here, right? Where
Yeah.
yeah, okay, maybe he's a Christian, maybe he's not, but unless he's being explicit about it, then okay, if he is explicit, then we got to do something. But in general, and leave a path back in case it's more of a we know we need to keep the forms of this up, but we're not going to go out of our way to make this a horrible offense, or we're not going to go after people really hard and make it impossible for them to kind of work their way back to us if they're found out. And that's a very interesting shift. And you mentioned the ancient city there, which I'm just going to do my brief plug. If you have never read this book, go read this book. It is such a amazing book, but most importantly, it really shifts the way that you understand the role of religion in the lives of ancient peoples. Like, this is such an alien way for people to operate in a Christian society, but particularly in this like post-Christian secular understanding. It could just the way, as you say, the fact that Christians would not participate in these rituals that were really designed to bond the city, the civitas, together. Like this is really the reason that Christianity is a problem. If they could just go through the rituals that still bound everyone together, plus Christianity, it probably wouldn't have been a big deal. But it's the fact that they reject those rituals that traditionally bound these societies together and have been core, really changes the way that people understand these interactions. And so, just give my plug constantly for the ancient city because it's so good. But we've already gotten well past the halfway part in the hour, and we haven't even mentioned the second emperor we're discussing yet. So I hate to do this, but can we speed run our Trajan so we can move on to Hadrian? What else do we need to know about Trajan's reign before we move on?
Yeah, no, we're almost done. So the last hurrah of Trajan is he sees an opportunity in the Parthian Empire. There's trouble in the Parthian state, and there's some kind of civil discord. And he uses a dispute as a pretext to invade the East. And so it has to do with the king of Armenia. We don't need to get into the details, but he annexes Armenia, which was a kind of a Roman Parthian shared client king. And he makes it a Roman province. And then he marches his army into Mesopotamia and he conquers it. And he gets all the way to the Persian Gulf, to near Basra today. The shore has gone out a little bit, and he erects a great statue of himself in true Trajan Trumpian fashion. He loves to put these great statues of himself in places, and did that on the bridge. And it was pretty easy, actually. The campaign was remarkably easy. He sacks Ctesiphon and Susa, these Parthian capitals, old capitals of the Persian Empire. And it's remarkably easy because the Parthians have all their forces committed elsewhere. But, he does have to fight some battles, and they win. But he wants to leave. He wants to leave in dignity and go to Babylon and visit Alexander's house, the house in which Alexander died in Babylon, and make a sacrifice to the genius of Alexander, who he admired. But he's cut short by another problem that kind of relates to the Christian problem of assimilation, which is the Jews. The Jews, right around this time, probably seeing the fact that Trajan was overcommitted in the East, decide to stage a huge, bloody uprising. It's called the Diaspora Revolt. And so Jews take over Cyrenaica in eastern Libya. They take over Cyprus. They take over, and they rise up in northern Mesopotamia. They're upset about Roman oppression. The Romans have had a relatively peaceful relationship. With the exception of the massive bloody Jewish wars of around AD 70 that ended in the destruction of the temple. There's a lot of assimilation on the part of Jews, but it isn't perfect. The Romans have let the Jews exist in a way they haven't let the Christians exist, because they're ancient, and they conquered. The Jews were worshiping their God first, and so the Romans sort of tried to respect that fact as long as they could keep the taxes and keep the peace flowing. But this is kind of what ends up detaining Trajan, and he can't get to Babylon to do his Alexander worship. And he comes back, and he's already kind of getting sick. He's like 60 years old at this point, 117 AD. And so he ends up not abandoning his conquests, but sort of cutting them short, and to try to deal with this Jewish problem. He has some subordinates take care of it. But before he can really see it through, he dies on the shores of Asia Minor, and sort of leaving all of his Eastern conquests in doubt. And sure enough, Hadrian comes on the scene at this point and starts changing things fast.
All right, well, let's just roll right into it. How does Hadrian come to power? What is he trying to address early on in his emperorship?
Hadrian is a grandnephew or a second cousin. He's a nephew of Trajan, and he's been kind of close to the imperial family. His accession was sort of dubious. It's thought that Trajan's wife, who really doted on Hadrian, they had been sort of the adoptive parents of Hadrian, that she was the one responsible for kind of forging a letter that Trajan adopted Hadrian on his deathbed, and she signed it herself, actually. So before the Senate can say anything about it, on the single day, they get news that Hadrian has been proclaimed emperor, and he's been proclaimed as such by the army, and there's nothing you can do about it. Get used to it. Which is sort of disturbing for them. They'd like to have a say in it, at least ceremonially, but it's a fait accompli when it gets reported to them. And quickly on in Hadrian's reign, he ends up, maybe calling for the execution of 4 prominent senators who'd been ex-consuls. Maybe it was on the independent initiative. He denies responsibility. He blames it on one of his subordinates, that these guys were executed, but they were probably rivals to the throne, so he probably called the hit. And so the Senate really doesn't like Hadrian from the start, and for basically all of his reign. Trajan just has this very kind of rough relationship with them. He's very kind of closed and hard to approach, and suspicious in the eyes of the Senate and later historians. He tries to make some concessions early on. He tries to say, all right, we'll make the Senate the final court of appeal, and no appeal can be made if the Senate rules in a case, even to the emperor himself, trying to throw them a little bone. It doesn't really work, and he continues to just rule by imperial decree rather than by senatorial decree throughout his reign. But one of the first things he does that really makes him unpopular with the Senate is he essentially abandons Trajan's eastern conquest. He calls off the legions. He tries not to make too big of a show of it, and he doesn't make any public statements like this was bad, this was overextension. He just withdraws the armies, and this is just seen as, because he saw it as unsustainable, and he had to actually. It was under Hadrian that the Jewish revolt was finally cleaned up. So he starts off on a bad foot with the Jews as well, and that'll come back to bite him. But that's kind of his first act as emperor, is retrenching, because he just felt that the eastern provinces couldn't be held, I suppose, and Rome kind of returns on the eastern end to its natural borders.
So you end up in the scenario where he is in many ways having the opposite effect with the Senate. Trajan is somebody who is well liked by the Senate, who's ingratiated himself with that class. Hadrian is not. Trajan is somebody who is expanding the borders, winning big territory, building momentum. Hadrian has the idea that no, we can't really afford to overextend. This is going to cause a lot of problems for us. What about on the home front? Was he building the way that Trajan was? Did he turn inward with his focus once, if he wasn't expanding? How did he treat the domestic situation?
Yeah, as soon as he gets to Rome, he becomes really one of Rome's greatest builders ever. Most famous of Trajan's buildings would probably be the Pantheon in Rome. Now, this had been built under Augustus. Marcus Agrippa, fake it, is the inscription. So Augustus's buddy Agrippa did it, but it had burned down partially under Domitian, I believe. And so Hadrian is the man responsible for turning the Pantheon into a domed structure. He built the dome. It was his idea. And it was the biggest dome in Europe until the Florentine Duomo and the Renaissance. Hadrian was fancied himself an architect. There's a story that the guy that Trajan had as his chief architect, who built the bridge and the forum, this guy Apollodorus. He and Hadrian had kind of sparred before Hadrian became emperor. He sort of made fun of Hadrian's architectural sketches. And when he was looking at one of Hadrian's architectural sketches when he was emperor, I mean, this uppity Greek says something like, okay, in this temple that you just sketched out, the statue, if it stood up, would bump its head. It's all disproportionate. You're no architect. And Hadrian doesn't appreciate this. He doesn't have that affability, and he ends up having the guy exiled and executed on some trumped up charges. But he does. He's one of Rome's great builders. He also builds the largest temple ever in Rome. This temple to Roma and Venus, and it's a kind of a Greek temple. So he has these massive games that he stages to win popular acclaim, and this soothes things with the Senate to some extent, but he's really eager to get the hell out of Rome as soon as he can once he starts these building projects, and he does very quickly head to the Rhine border to start his a further kind of like one of his great achievements is sort of like Hadrian's Wall. So on a step to that, we'll get to Hadrian's Wall in a sec, but he firms up the Rhine border. He sets the legions to work building a palisade, and in a way, it's a way of pointing out, we're not going to expand any further, right? I'm not going to try to clobber the Germans. This is where Rome ends, and this is all that matters. And he does a similar thing in England, in Scotland, right? Hadrian's Wall is very close to the Scottish border today. It had been conquered under Domitian, actually. This guy Agricola, Tacitus writes the biography of, captured it And Hadrian said, nope, we're gonna retrench, and this is where civilization ends, and that's where barbarism begins. This is what matters on this side of the wall, and that we don't, they're not even worth conquering. I think that's a lot of the message of his walls, and he makes another one in Mauritania in similar fashion. So he keeps on his retrenchment process, which does not win him a lot of favor with the Senate, but it is kind of tied in with something that we should talk about. Is Hadrian was incredibly popular in the provinces too.
Well, let's go ahead and address this, because you already mentioned that Roman citizenship was a huge problem for both Trajan and Hadrian, the issues that they had to tackle, questions of citizenship. And like you said, provincial citizenship was pretty rare in general. So what was his relationship with the provinces? What was the way in which he approached Roman citizenship, and how that play back in the homeland?
Well, one of the things you see in Hadrian is he loves being out in the provinces. He's the traveling emperor. He's out of Rome more than he's in Rome. He's no emperor had traveled as much as him. He makes a big circuit of the whole empire, and he ends up in Greece, spending a lot of time in Greece that he was particularly fond of. He's called jokingly by some of his contemporaries the Little Greek, Graeculus. Um, and because he's a fan of Greek philosophy and art, and so he builds the temple of Olympian Zeus at Athens, and he elevates a couple of important citizens to senatorial status in Greece. He celebrates the Eleusinian mysteries. This is all kind of part of Hadrian's vision of turning Rome into a commonwealth with a common culture that's founded on Hellenism. The Romans were great conquerors, but even early on in the days of the Punic Wars and Scipio Africanus, the 3rd century, the Romans really started to admire Greek culture, the mythic tradition, the philosophy, the rhetoric, the history. The first Roman histories were written in Greek, so it's a big part of the cultural DNA of Rome. And Hadrian really wanted to lean into that and to spread this kind of Roman Hellenism as this civilizing force, as a kind of cultural unity, even if the people in the far-flung provinces aren't necessarily Roman citizens. At least we can all agree that we have a kind of cultural commonality. And so he patronizes philosophers and orators. But for citizenship in particular, what he does is citizenship has started to get diluted. So this is one of the things that the Romans did not do. Is they did not really, until at least the Edict of Caracalla in 212, citizenship wasn't really the basis of Roman unity. But one of the things that he did was to legalize this distinction between honestiores and humiliores. So like the nobler people and the more humble people, who have literally different legal privileges. There's a kind of a 2-tier system of citizenship, because they, as citizenship expanded, the Romans felt that something was missing from the package. And so humiliores could be citizens, but they could be flogged, for example, whereas you couldn't physically punish or flog a Roman citizen. You couldn't crucify, or you couldn't physically flog or punish a Roman citizen in the past, but now one of the honestiores. And also you couldn't crucify a Roman citizen in the past, but then you can crucify a citizen who's in the humiliores. So he introduced that legal distinction to kind of solve that problem, and really sees culture as the basis of the United Empire that he wants to found.
Again, something that we could probably take into our modern day, where people are trying to find a binding agent for an American empire that has sprawled and grown so many and brought so many people in from the provinces, and doesn't know how to handle that. Who's a citizen, who isn't, what does citizenship mean, what binds you together. We even have tried to implement in some ways our own 2-tier system of justice, which has not gone very well. But we can see that there's nothing new under the sun here, right? Like these problems, they change, they shift, they take on new technological issues, these kind of things. But at their heart, these are the struggles of all empires, all peoples, all rulers, all nations. And so we see this echo throughout history, even if the dynamics shift due to technology, other advancements, these kind of things. So you said that Hadrian having issues with kind of the Jewish rebellion and putting that away would come back to bite him. What did you mean by that?
Well, so the Jews are pacified after the diaspora revolt, the Second Jewish Revolt, but and Hadrian kind of sees the solution potentially to the Jewish problem is making them more Greek and making them more Roman. And the details are kind of hazy because of the sources are very spotty. But essentially, what seems to have happened is he went to Jerusalem, and he decided that one of the big problems with the Jews is they have this capital that and they have these hopes of restoring the temple. There was still prophecies that the temple would be rebuilt 70 years after it was destroyed under Titus and Vespasian, AD 70. So it's around 130 AD that he decides to crush those hopes finally, and he renames Jerusalem Aelia Capitolina, and it's named after Aelius is his family, and then Capitolina is because he dedicates the city to the worship of Capitoline Jupiter, the supreme god of the Romans, Jupiter Optimus Maximus, and he has a great temple of Jupiter Capitolinus built there. So he just finally quashes all the hopes of the Jews restoring the sacred Jerusalem. He bans Jews from entering the city ever on pain of death. And this probably was one of the causes of a great bloody revolt under the leadership of a guy named Simon Bar Kokhba. That's what the Romans called him, at least, who shadowy figure. Unfortunately, we don't have great sources on him, but he leads this really successful, well, not successful, but long-standing and very bloody guerrilla revolt against the Romans, and the Romans have to commit something like, I think it's like 10 legions. Hadrian has to call in legions from the Danube borders, and it's just this incredible, bloody, demoralizing defeat, revolt that he has to put down. That kind of like crushes his hopes for Roman unity under Hellenism. Like there's going to be some element in society potentially that's just not going to ever be able to get on the program, and that was the legacy that Hadrian had to leave by crushing this revolt, by renaming the province of Judea Syria Palestina. So Palestine is an old name, but he basically renames it Palestine and says an end to the memory of the Jews. He was so upset over this, and that was what happened with the third Jewish revolt, actually.
Yeah, and again, that draws us a very interesting parallel to today, where so much of our rulership is trying to crush the particularity out of individual peoples in the hope that they can create some kind of unifying understanding, some kind of unifying culture. And what a guy like Hadrian comes to find is that no matter how grand your efforts are and how much power you wield, there is always some element of peoples brought under your rule that are just not going to conform. They're not going to assimilate. And that is always the difficulty with trying to kind of impose these supranational identities across people that just aren't naturally born to them, right? Like you probably could get a lot of Hellenic culture into many of the Roman peoples because they had been aping it for so long. That's the Romans inherited so much from the Greeks and had been admiring aspects of it for so long. But once you stretched it out far enough to people who just had no real connection to it, eventually kind of fell apart. And once again, we can kind of see how obviously the attempts to do similar things by the United States has, we're just not going to get democracy in Afghanistan. Like it's just not gonna happen, right? And so that it's pretty easy to understand that. All right, well, we're coming up near the end here, so I'll guess not to try to crush too much of this into the last few minutes, but the story that I always heard, right, was that Trajan is the last great expander. Like he's the glory of Rome. We're going to go out and, like you said, we're going to be this military empire. The Senate is going to be rah for this great soldier who's going to go out, push the boundaries as much as possible. And he acquired a lot of glory and rightfully so in that manner. but Hadrian was really the emperor that helped the empire to continue for probably much longer than it otherwise would have, because he understood that while the glory was important and the majesty of conquest was important, that proper administration, restraint, understanding, unification was important to continue the legacy of the empire. And so it wasn't so much the geographical boundaries that ultimately would determine whether or not Rome continued, but its ability to perhaps have a little bit of its own, exercise some prudence, recognize when holding back, limiting, unifying was more important than necessarily pushing out, expanding, building the greatest statue to the glory of your conquest. What do you feel about that contrast? Do you think that's accurate? Do you think that Hadrian's approach did ultimately, increase the longevity and health of the empire?
I think so. And he was, very unpopular with the Senate, even in the historians of the time. They have a much dimmer view of Hadrian. He's not as bad as Domitian, but they preferred Trajan to Hadrian. And yet, if you go to any museum in the Mediterranean, you're more likely to see a statue of Hadrian than you are of Trajan. He was wildly popular among the provincials. If you see a statue of Antinous, that was Hadrian's little kind of Greek boyfriend. Another story for another time. He's everywhere too. And that's a token of their appreciation of Hadrian. They want to look good in the eyes of Hadrian because they love him. So they make a statue to this lover Antinous, who died tragically at age 20 in a boating accident. So I think that Hadrian really did set the empire on a firm footing. After him, you get Antoninus Pius, one of the most peaceful, kind of not story-worthy emperors of all time. Just nothing much happened under Antoninus Pius. And he also made Antoninus Pius adopt Marcus Aurelius as his successor. So another one of the 5 good emperors of the so-called adoptive Kaiserzeit of Germans. And, it was gave them credit. It was one of the happiest periods of all mankind under the 5 good emperors of Rome. And Hadrian was kind of the pinnacle of that for Gibbon.
Excellent. So like I said, I think this is just a fascinating period of history, no matter what, because I'm just a huge nerd for Roman history, but also I think this is a very interesting period for us to reflect on in our own moment. Obviously, things are different. History rhymes, but it doesn't necessarily repeat. We can see the themes. We can see the problems that have been addressed and the way that they've been addressed, the tensions, and the way that they echo into our own moment. And that can help us decide, do we feel we are in this Trajan moment? Or do we feel we're more of in a Hadrian moment? What do we as Americans need for the well-being? Can we practice the discipline necessary to make a Hadrian move if we need to? Or is the glory and expansion of a Trajan really ultimately what we're looking for? I think these are all important things to consider, again, as Donald Trump, who I feel embodies a little bit of both of these guys, right?
Definitely.
A lot of his supporters and are asking for fewer foreign wars, fewer expansions, but he recognizes the glory of being able to go out and acquire territory and what is best and what is the proper balance. Again, I just think it's a fascinating moment to reflect on history, these examples, and carry that forward into what we might want to do as a nation, as a people. So, Alex, for those who want to learn more, be familiar with your work, where should they be looking for what you're doing?
Well, you can find the Cost of Glory podcast wherever you get your podcasts, including YouTube, or go to costofglory.com. That's my website. We run retreats and courses too every now and then. But and I'm on Twitter at Cost of Glory.
Excellent. All right, guys. Well, make sure that you are following Alex, listening to his podcast. Yes, one more excellent history podcast. You can add it. You should. And of course, if it's your first time on this YouTube channel, you need to subscribe, click the bell, notifications, all that stuff, so that you know when we go live. This is a pre-recorded episode. I'm actually in London right now. So if you have any super chats or questions, sorry, but we won't be able to take that right now. I appreciate the support of the show, but obviously we're doing this pre-taped, so we can't go and take a look at everything you're doing. If you want to get these broadcasts as podcasts, make sure you subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show on your favorite podcast network. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And as always, I will talk to you next time.